After 3 years of marriage, the little canary George kept came to confront me. She loudly questioned how this old, unattractive woman like me had the nerve to cling to George. I calmly raised my eyes, because during the hardest years of his life, I was the one who stood by him. The young girl raised her head, her eyes full of contempt. So what if you met George a few years before me? Is that really something to brag about? Chapter 1. George appeared just as I was facing off against his little canary. He slowly walked over to me, gently tucking a strand of hair that had blown loose behind my ear. Willow, why are you here? I waved the phone in my hand. Didn't you ask me to come? George frowned slightly, while the little canary behind him grew anxious and grabbed George's arm. George, I'm sorry. It was me who texted you using your phone. I just can't stand living like this anymore. She turned to glare at me angrily. If it weren't for her hogging the title of Mrs. Fu, we would have long ago. Get out. Before the canary could finish her sentence, George cut her off. What? The girl was stunned, tears welling up in her eyes. Anna, I said get out. George's voice was flat, his gaze towards the girl as cold and indifferent as if she was a stranger. Why? The girl bit her lip, her face turning pale. She probably didn't understand how the man who had been so tender with her in bed just yesterday could change so drastically today. Compared to my wife, do you even measure up? George let out a small laugh and spoke slowly. I knew then that George would never have anything more to do with this girl. She was too naive. So naive that she mistook the games of the rich for love, and even had the audacity to come and flaunt it in front of me. Chapter 2. I met George when he was only 8 years old, long before he was the long-lost son of the Fu family. We were both kidnapped by human traffickers and sold to a wealthy household, where we stayed for many years until the police rescued us and sent us to an orphanage. Life in the orphanage was sometimes tough, with not enough food to eat and occasional bullying and false accusations. But compared to our previous life, it was much better. Because we were too old, no one wanted to adopt us. George and I supported each other and relied on one another as we made our way into society. We went through the bitterness of being scammed out of money and the embarrassment of sharing a bowl of noodles while being looked down upon by others. During the coldest winter in B City, the heating in our rental apartment was cut off. I leaned against George's shoulder, looking out the window of our small apartment. I asked him, George, what's your dream? He held my hand tightly and said in a deep voice, to make a lot of money and marry Willow Lu in a grand ceremony. That's me. George really made it happen. He gave me a one-of-a-kind ring and a wedding dress covered in diamonds. When he married me, there was a sea of flowers that stretched for miles, and hundreds of drones formed a meteor shower in the sky, spelling out my name. The entertainment headlines were all about the Fu family spending 1 billion yuan on our wedding. People around me were envious. They said it was surprising that the Fu family, a well-known and prestigious family in the capital, would allow George to marry someone like me, who had no background or status. I knew how hard George had worked for this. Even now, there are still scars on his back from being whipped as punishment by his family. The other branches of the Fu family are always eyeing the main family's business. George often works late into the night, flying back and forth between countries. One time, he was so exhausted that he coughed up blood. I watched his increasingly thin figure, my heart aching but helpless, so I could only restrain my temper and work hard to be a good Mrs. Fu. Chapter 3. At a banquet full of powerful and influential people, the ladies gathered together, casually discussing their husbands' extramarital affairs. To them, love seemed like a joke. Seeing my silence, Mrs. Chin, who was sitting beside me, took my hand. Willow, you'll have to get used to it. As George expands the Fu family business, it's inevitable that he'll have a few mistresses. I was stunned for a moment, then firmly shook my head. George wouldn't do that. Mrs. Chin smiled faintly, neither agreeing nor disagreeing. She said, when a person reaches the heights of power, they face countless temptations. The look in her eyes seemed to pierce through me, as if she was seeing something else. Chapter 4. I never believed that George would betray me, so when I saw through the crack in the door George allowing one woman to kiss him while another was unbuttoning his shirt, I felt like I was dreaming. I had never seen George like this before. He sat there lazily, casually taking a drag from a cigarette, the smoke he exhaled blurring his face. The chill that seeped into my limbs gradually spread to my heart, leaving me paralyzed. It wasn't until a guest at the banquet suddenly noticed me and hurriedly stood up to call me Mrs. Fu that I finally snapped out of it. I can't remember what George's expression was like at that moment. I only remember him pushing those women away in a panic, chasing after me, and holding me tightly in his arms. He kept saying in my ear, "Willow, don't cry. I love you. I only love you." He said he only loved me and that something like this would never happen again. I don't know if he was comforting me or trying to comfort himself. It's said that when people encounter something that causes them pain, their first instinct is to escape. But can running away really make things disappear? That night, I watched George's sleeping face, tears silently streaming down as my heart ached like it was being cut into pieces. Once the seed of doubt is planted, it takes root and grows in the heart. During that time, I felt like I was turning into a paranoid, neurotic person. Every business trip George took, every social event, every vibration of his phone, every phone call he answered became a reason for my anxiety. Finally, one night when George came home late, our conflict erupted. I smelled the scent of gardenias on his coat. I questioned him, hysterically shouting at him, not only smashing all the expensive porcelain in the house but also breaking our wedding photo in the living room. "Willow, in this circle, no one can remain untouched." George wearily pinched the bridge of his nose, looking at me with a complicated expression. "It's my fault, but the one I love most is you." George left, telling me to calm down before he did. I collapsed to my knees, crying with my face in my hands, the glass cutting into my palm, mixing blood with tears. I had thought about divorce, but I was unwilling, truly unwilling. I had foolishly tried to resist worldly desires with shallow love, and the outcome was predictable. The suppressed pain led me to depression. I trapped myself in the memories of the past, in the vows George had once made. Mrs. Chin was the first to notice that I was ill. She sighed and tightly held my hand. "Willow, you're walking the same path I did." I lowered my eyes, my heart sinking to the bottom. I didn't know if George felt any guilt. His wife was at home, trying to slit her wrists due to depression, while he was indulging in pleasure with other women. Chapter 5. Anna would not be the last canary George kept. Within a few days, I heard at a gathering that George had recently taken care of a pair of sisters. The older sister was gentle. The younger one was bright and lively. I heard that the sisters were very open in bed. No wonder George always looked satisfied when he came home. Tonight, George came home early. After showering, he smelled of fresh body wash. "I heard from Aunt Lou that you painted for 3 hours today. Are you tired?" George hugged me from behind, burying his head in my shoulder. I put down my brush, freed myself from his embrace, and carefully put away my painting supplies. Not tired. During my depression, I took up painting, probably because only when I was painting could I subconsciously forget the people and things that suffocated me. "Willow, this painting of yours is really beautiful." George's gentle voice reached my ears, and I couldn't help but smile a little. Yes, it had to be beautiful. After all, this painting was meant as a gift. By the way, Mom asked if we would go home for New Year's this year. She said she couldn't reach you by phone. George patiently wiped the paint stains from my hands with a wet tissue, his movements as gentle as if handling a piece of porcelain. "We're not going." I firmly refused, pulling my hand away in the process. The mom George referred to as my biological mother. Over the years, George had been using his connections to help me find my family. And finally, 2 years ago, he found them. My biological father had passed away, and my mother had remarried and given birth to a younger sister, who is now in her final year of college and about to graduate. Her real reason for wanting me to go home for New Year's was to ask me to arrange a job for my sister in George's company. My mother said she felt guilty towards me, so she gave all her love to my sister. But now that I've returned and we've reunited, shouldn't she treat me a little better? But the reality is that she rarely contacts me. It's always me reaching out to her, reminding her to be safe when it rains, to stay warm when it snows, and sending her gifts during holidays. Even though I told her I was allergic to celery, she still put it in my bowl. I can't see any love for me in her actions. "What's wrong? Did you have a fight with her?" George ruffled my hair, his voice tinged with amusement. I don't want to keep forcing this relationship anymore. It's exhausting. From now on, she's no longer my mother. I looked into George's eyes and said calmly. Maybe my words were too blunt. As George froze for a moment, I don't know what he was thinking, but he pressed his lips together and looked up at me. Willow, you seem to have changed a lot. I smiled slightly. Have I? Yes, you have. George blinked at me like a child, his tone carrying a hint of grievance. You used to ask me when I would be home for dinner, but now you haven't asked in a long time. You also don't pick out my ties for me in the morning anymore. But George, people don't change suddenly. When I asked when you'd be home, you said you were working, but in reality, you were with another woman. The tie I picked out for you would be taken off by someone else in a different way between the sheets. These things constantly remind me of your betrayal, making me feel sick. Chapter 6. On the morning of New Year's Eve, I was putting up couplets on the door of my studio when George called, saying he would come home early tonight to spend New Year's with me. I simply replied, okay. Then I hung up, because I wasn't tall enough. I couldn't reach the top of the door frame and had to stand on my tiptoes. Just as I was wondering whether I should get a stool, a slender, fair hand suddenly supported the red paper that was about to fall. I turned around and looked up at the young man in front of me. He was wearing a white hoodie, with a smile in his almond-shaped eyes and a look of affection on his face. Comrade Willow, not calling me to help? That's not fair. I met David at an art exhibition. As fate would have it, every time we attended an art exhibition, George would cancel his meetings to accompany me, except for that one time. I was standing in front of a painting full of sunflowers, the brush strokes feeling somewhat familiar to me, reminding me of an underwater painting I bought at a charity event a year ago. The ladies who were with me thought I was crazy for spending $30 million on an unknown painting. I'm not someone who likes to spend money recklessly, but I bought that painting because I saw myself in it. The hesitation, the pain, the struggle. The sunflowers before me were vibrant and bright, like notes dancing in the air. If these two paintings were by the same artist, I was curious, what had he gone through in such a short year to bring about such a change in his perspective? David appeared at that moment. When I looked up, I accidentally met the burning gaze of the young man. Do you like it? If you do, I can give it to you. I thought he was joking until the exhibition organizer came to me, handing me the painting. Chapter 7. Since that day, David began to appear frequently in my life. Even someone as dense as I am understood what he had in mind. I emphasized more than once that I was married. Yet he persisted, turning a deaf ear to my warnings. Finally, during an outdoor sketching trip, I harshly tore down all pretenses with him. You know, I hate people like you who willingly degrade themselves to be the third party and ruin other people's families. Can you please stop appearing in front of me? I really find you disgusting. David was stunned for several seconds, his departing figure looking desolate. My words that day were effective, but only for 2 days. David had a flamboyant personality, and at the time, we were like two extremes. But in some ways, we were alike. Once he decided on something, he wouldn't easily let go. Sometimes, his stubbornness gave me headaches, but at other moments, I was grateful he was always there behind me, appearing like a gift from the heavens whenever I needed him. Chapter 8. By the time David and I left the amusement park, it was already very late. My phone buzzed again. George was calling. I simply turned off the phone. Aren't you worried about not answering? David raised an eyebrow, his voice tinged with curiosity. I chuckled and asked him, "Where are we going next?" He gleefully took out a pink helmet and placed it on my head, then bent down and knocked on it, casting a meaningful glance behind me. "We're going somewhere he can't find us." The motorcycle roared to life, its tires screeching against the pavement. I instinctively tightened my grip around David's waist. He carried me through empty streets and winding alleys, the wind whooshing past my ears and the lights of countless homes passing by. Before long, vibrant fireworks blossomed in the night sky. David shouted into the air, "In the new year, I hope Willow finds peace and joy and moves forward with courage." I smiled and, mimicking him, shouted as well. Chapter 9. By the time I returned to the villa, it was already late at night. The living room lights were off, and there was a strong smell of smoke lingering in the air. George was sitting wearily on the sofa. When he saw me come in, he abruptly stood up, forcing a smile. Willow, I couldn't reach you on the phone. Did you spend New Year's at your mom's place? I hummed in response, taking the excuse he gave me to step down from the situation. Just as I was about to turn off the lights and go to bed, George's hoarse voice suddenly echoed in my ear. Willow, I had a dream last night. I dreamed that you fell in love with someone else and didn't want me anymore. After a few seconds of silence, he asked again, Willow, will you always love me? Perhaps it was because I didn't respond for a long time that George propped himself up, staring at me anxiously, as if trying to find the answer in my eyes. I suddenly found it a little amusing. Fate truly is a cycle. In the past, I used to ask myself more than once, does George really still love me? At that time, I thought, maybe he did. He filled the garden with the flowers I liked, bought the expensive Lu Shui Bei for my birthday, and established an art foundation in my name. 1 year, I fell ill, and to get a talisman for my safety, he knelt down step by step from the foot of the mountain to the top, in the midst of a snowstorm, right? He must love me, right? But his love could be shared with so many others. He could love me and still have ambiguous relationships with other women. I knew George was a playboy. In that circle, it was common to have threesomes or even more people involved. The ladies I had tea with also advised me not to take love too seriously, but I couldn't accept that. So I started looking for all sorts of details in our life, trying to prove that, compared to other women, George loved me just a little bit more, until David told me that true love doesn't need to be proven. Chapter 10. Perhaps because of the new year, George had been staying home for the past few days. When I returned from the studio, I was surprised to see him in an apron, cooking in the kitchen. What made you suddenly decide to cook yourself? I leaned against the wall, asking George in surprise. Willow, I was thinking about our past. George looked up at me, his gaze filled with tenderness and affection. The days we fought together to build our life. Those are memories no one can replace. I felt a sense of disorientation. The past. It's such a distant word. 21-year-old George said. I only cook for my wife. And I only love my wife. 22-year-old George said. Childbirth is too painful for women. Willow, let's not have kids, okay? 23-year-old George said. Willow can live without George, but George would die without Willow. Back then, we were so ambitious, with only each other in our eyes, believing that true love was invincible. But later, we realized that we were too naive. True love might be invincible, but true love is also ever-changing. Chapter 11. With those thoughts, I suddenly found everything to be utterly meaningless. What are you thinking about? George came out of the shower, hugging me from behind, his warm breath spraying across my neck. He tentatively nibbled on my earlobe, his hands skillfully lifting my nightgown. Willow, let's have a baby. Yes, it's truly meaningless. George is no longer the George from the past, and I am no longer the Willow from the past. I grabbed George's wandering hand, turned around, and calmly said, George, I'm afraid of getting AIDS. George's face instantly turned ashen, and he stared at me, dumbfounded, for several seconds. Actually, that New Year's Eve, you found me, didn't you? After leaving the amusement park, I noticed a car following us. It was George's car. He thought that as long as we didn't openly acknowledge it, our relationship would remain the same as before. Little did he know that beneath the calm surface was a turbulent sea, and our marriage had already reached the brink of collapse. Willow, George's voice trembled as he spoke. I sighed. I had known George for 20 years, been married for 3, and at this moment, our fate had finally reached its end. Do you remember the fire in the villa? I asked George. I remember, because the kitchen fire wasn't turned off. But actually, that fire was set by me on purpose. Facing George's shocked eyes, I suddenly felt a sense of relief, as if the past had all been read through, leaving my heart at ease. Chapter 12. I am someone who holds on to the past. All the things from our time in the rental apartment. From the big items like the washing machine and television to the small things like the paper crane George folded for me. I kept them all in a special room, But that fire almost burned away all of my memories with George. George looked at me with hesitation, as if he had guessed something. You guessed right. It was to burn those things. When the fire started, the thick smoke billowed, and I suddenly had a terrifying thought. I just walked straight into the flames. If it weren't for David suddenly calling me, I might have really burned to death. Why? George grabbed my hand, on the verge of breaking down. You ask why? George, do you really not know? I looked up at him. George staggered back a step, the color draining from his face. I got up and walked to the bedroom, pulling out a box from under the bed and emptying its contents. Every time you had an ambiguous relationship with a woman, I would write a letter. There are 56 letters in total here. I pulled open a drawer and poured out the pills from a bottle. What I take every day isn't supplements but medication for depression. In George's dazed gaze, I unbuttoned my shirt and showed him the scar on my abdomen. I lied to you when I said the scar was from an injury I got while traveling. It wasn't. I turned my head, and before I knew it, tears started to fall uncontrollably. George, we once had our own child, but that day I had a car accident, and the baby didn't make it. The only proof that she had ever existed in this world was this shallow scar. Willow, why didn't you tell me all this? George's eyes turned red as he looked at me, his voice full of pain and sorrow. George, I did call you, but at that time, you were playing a role-playing game in bed with another woman. The day of the car accident, I was bleeding profusely. My first thought wasn't to call 911 but to call George. The phone rang for a long time before he answered. I cried out George's name several times, but then I heard a woman's voice. I heard that woman shyly say that she didn't want to play nurse again next time, and I heard George lazily agree, followed by the sound of packaging being torn open. At that moment, I clutched my phone tightly. My heart felt like it was being sliced open, like I was plunged into an icy pit, as if countless cold arrows were piercing through my body. As my consciousness began to fade, I saw David frantically pushing through the crowd to reach me. His lips were moving, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. I could only grasp his hand and repeatedly say, "It hurts so much." It really did hurt. Not just physically but emotionally as well. George, telling you all this isn't to make you pity me, but to let you know that there is no longer any possibility between us. George sat on the edge of the bed, his eyes dim, his hands helplessly running through his hair. Willow, I broke my vows. It's all my fault. Why does heaven punish you? It should be punishing me. George's voice choked with tears. How did it come to this? He suddenly began to cry like a child. Yes. How did it come to this? I used to ask myself that question countless times. After all, we once loved each other so much. But today, I finally realized, in this relationship, I gave my all with the utmost sincerity. So the one who should feel regret, the one who should be unwilling, is not me. George, let's get a divorce. I composed myself and calmly spoke the words. I also want to move forward. I glanced out the window and let out a gentle sigh of relief. Chapter 13. A cold front swept through B City, making this winter feel colder than any before. David wrapped a scarf around my neck, but I didn't want to wear it. Feeling it didn't match my outfit today, he gritted his teeth in frustration, saying, "Comrade Willow, if you don't listen to good advice, you'll suffer the consequences." Though he said that, he still tucked my hands into his coat pockets, holding them tightly. It was at this moment that Mary appeared, her expression complicated as she looked at David and me, her brows furrowed so tightly that she could kill a fly. Mary, my biological mother. In the cafe, she and I sat face to face while David waited outside. "What do you need from me?" I tried to compose myself. "Willow, are you really going to divorce George?" "Yes. Marriage isn't a game for a man of George's status. Which one doesn't cheat? You need to be a magnanimous woman. Learn to tolerate and understand him." Mary looked at me, speaking in a tone that suggested she was giving me heartfelt advice. Seeing that I seemed indifferent, her expression turned a bit displeased. "That young man outside is much younger than you, isn't he? Willow, you're almost 30. You're not young anymore. Can you guarantee that he'll love you forever?" I couldn't stand the sarcasm in her words, so I interrupted her. Did George send you to be his spokesperson? Her expression didn't change, and I let out a small laugh. Apparently not. Let me guess. Does Uncle Wong need a favor from George? Uncle Wong, the man my mother married after my father. A flicker of embarrassment crossed Mary's face, but she quickly regained her composure. Willow, I'm only doing this for your own good. What a convenient excuse. Doing it for my own good. I'll ask you just one thing. If Alicia's future husband cheats on her, would you give her the same advice? Alicia is Uncle Wong's daughter, my half-sister. Mary's eyes darted away, unable to meet my gaze. I stood up, letting out a cold laugh. Ms. Lee, the thin thread of mother-daughter affection between us ends here. And as for Uncle Wong's little company, I'll make sure to tell George to leave it to its fate. After all, we were married, so I'm sure he'll grant me the small request. Mary's face darkened immediately, her voice sharp and her expression angry. Willow, we're family. I sneered, curling my lips. We're not even on the same household register. So how are we family? Chapter 14. The divorce wasn't as smooth as I had imagined. The lawyer called again, bluntly saying that the other party's lawyer was constantly delaying, finding the draft of the divorce agreement unsatisfactory no matter how it was written. The last time I saw George was 2 weeks ago, at the villa's entrance. His chin was bruised, and the light in his eyes had dimmed. He looked at the luggage I was moving out, hoarsely asking, "Are you really leaving? I can move out of the villa instead." "That won't be necessary." I shook my head. As I was about to leave, George stopped me, saying that he had already dealt with that woman. I suddenly recalled the phone call I had received that day, the noise on the other end chaotic, accompanied by the sound of shattering glass. The woman was screaming, sobbing as she apologized to me. If she hadn't called out my name, I would have thought it was necessary to call the police. I've always known George's methods. That woman's fate likely wasn't a good one. Chapter 15. After some thought, I dialed George's number. "Let's talk. There's no point in dragging this out any longer." That day, George drove me from the southern part of the city all the way to the north, talking nonstop along the way. "Willow, do you remember this place? We bought our first parrot here." He pointed to the flower and bird market on the left. "Willow, this supermarket entrance is still the same. So crowded you can't even park a car. I wonder if the night market in the northern district is still open, and if the stall selling the stinky tofu you love has moved." George's eyes softened as he recalled something. "You used to have a special fondness for smelly things." I looked out the window, remaining silent. What George didn't know was that after we got married, I had visited these places many times by myself. The stinky tofu and durian that I loved, I hadn't had them since becoming Mrs. Fu. "Willow, the wonton shop we used to frequent is still open." The car suddenly stopped in front of the wonton shop, and George's voice carried a hint of excitement. The wonton shop was close to our old rental apartment. When we were rushing to work in the mornings, we sometimes didn't have time to cook and would stop for wontons. During the hot summer days, I would be sleepy, and George would fold a flyer into a small fan to cool me down. After fanning me, he would fan the wontons, and once they were cool, he'd wake me up to eat. Years have passed since those days. "Shall we eat here one more time?" George turned to me, looking at me with a pleading expression. I hesitated for a few seconds, then nodded. The owner still remembered us. She placed 2 steaming bowls of wontons in front of us and smiled at George. "Young man, you're finally here. I haven't seen you in a long time. Your girlfriend has come alone several times." The smile on George's face froze instantly, and he looked up at me sharply. I lowered my gaze and explained calmly. "Auntie, we've already broken up." The owner looked a bit awkward. After she left, George asked me softly, "Willow, have you been here many times?" "Yes." After a long pause, he lowered his head, his fingers gripping the spoon turning white. "I'm such a beast." The steam blurred my view of George's expression. "Get the divorce papers ready as soon as possible. Let's not make this ugly. I don't want our next meeting to be in court." As I spoke, I saw George's eyelashes tremble, and a tear fell into his soup. "I understand." His voice was hoarse. "Extra, George." Chapter 1. The news of George and Willow's divorce shocked the entire circle. Their love story, once envied by so many, was now a source of deep sighs. George left with nothing but the villa where he and Willow had once lived. The villa was empty, devoid of any warmth. George thought about the time they had just moved in, when Willow insisted on going to the mall together to buy appliances. This could be arranged with just a phone call. Why make it so complicated? George didn't understand. Willow had smiled brightly. You don't get it. This is what life is about. Back then, Willow had held his arm, bargaining with the mall manager. George had watched her chattering away, finding her utterly adorable. Thinking about this, George, sitting on the sofa, couldn't help but smile a little. Willow. George unconsciously called out Willow's name, but unfortunately, the only response was the ticking of the clock on the wall. He stood up in a panic, accidentally bumping into the corner of the table. Staggering, he ran to the room they had lived in on the second floor. But when he opened the door, the person he longed for was not there. A man in his 30s, feeling helpless, sat on the floor and began to cry. He wanted to find something from the past to hold on to, but there was nothing left. Willow had taken everything, except for those 56 letters, each one piercing his heart with every word. But who could he blame? It was all his own doing. He was the one who betrayed Willow, who betrayed their marriage, who betrayed their love. He was reaping what he had sown, and he deserved it. Chapter 2. When the news of Willow's engagement reached George, he suddenly had a ridiculous thought. If Willow wanted, he would be willing to be the other man. In the end, he laughed at himself. He realized he was being too naive. Willow probably found even the thought of looking at him disgusting. Before Willow's engagement, George went to see David. He thought that since this man would spend the rest of his life with Willow, he needed to see what kind of person he was, to see if he was reliable, if he would treat Willow well. George waited for a long time and finally saw David downstairs. Let's talk. David nodded, quickly choosing a location. Before George could say anything, David spoke first. If you're here to convince me to give up, you might as well forget it. David had endured being called a homewrecker and scolded by Comrade Willow for years. Now that she was finally divorced and he was so close to being with her, not even a king could make him back down now. If you're worried about Willow being wronged, you're overthinking it. I'm not dead, and my parents adore Willow. George had already investigated David's background. The Hahn family did business abroad, and David had an older brother who had passed away unexpectedly. After his brother's death, David took over the Hahn family business and did quite well. David had returned to the country a few years ago, likely to expand their business domestically. With everything David had said, what else could George say? As George was leaving, David received a call, and the coldness in his eyes instantly melted away. George could guess who was on the other end. Willow said to buy some groceries so I can make her favorite sweet and sour ribs. David tugged at his collar, casually revealing the diamond ring on his finger. Mr. Fu, would you like to join us for dinner? I'm quite a good cook. Sweet and sour ribs. George's face paled. When he and Willow were together, he used to make that dish often. After making it so many times, George would ask, "Aren't you tired of eating this?" Back then, Willow would hug his neck, laughing. I could never get tired of anything George makes. No, thanks. Just take good care of her, George thought. Inviting him to dinner, what a cruel way to twist the knife. Chapter 3. On the day Willow got married, George dissolved his company. He locked himself in the villa and just sat on the floor. He estimated that by now, the wedding must be wrapping up. What was Willow doing right now? Toasting? Handing out wedding favors? Sitting on the floor, George forced a bitter smile. He finally understood how Willow must have felt the day she found out he was with another woman. Actually, the day they left the civil affairs office. George, watching Willow's back, had already realized that they would never cross paths again in this lifetime. But he stubbornly refused to admit it. Sometimes, George would deliberately drive to the area where Willow lived, hoping to run into her. He never expected that one day he actually would. Willow's shoelace had come undone, and he saw David kneel down, gently tying it into a bow for her. He saw them leaving the supermarket, Willow holding a sugar-coated hawthorn stick. and David gently wiping her mouth. George was dazed for a moment. Those loving scenes, they should have been between him and Willow. How had it turned into David and Willow? How had he managed to lose Willow? His heart twisted in pain, as if an invisible hand was squeezing it tight, the sharp nails piercing through the thin membrane encasing his heart. George felt so crushed he could barely breathe, the pain making him want to kill himself. Those who betray true love should swallow 1,000 needles. As George stood up from the floor, that phrase suddenly came to mind. He went to the kitchen, grabbed a knife, and slashed it across his wrist. Blood flowed out instantly, dripping onto the wooden floor. A fortune teller once told George that he was destined to be lonely for the rest of his life. Back then, he didn't believe it, but now, he realized how true it was. George sat on the balcony and opened the window. The spring breeze felt like a lover's kiss, tender and delicate. He looked at the hint of green sprouting outside, and gradually, his consciousness began to fade. In the next life, George hoped he would treat his Willow well. Extra, David. Chapter 1. Willow got really angry again and even smashed a bowl in her fury. David, why are you here again? Do you even know what the word shame means? Do your parents know you're playing the third wheel outside? David awkwardly rubbed the tip of his nose, staying silent. But his heart was pounding loudly. A third wheel is someone who destroys another's relationship. Who did David destroy? Did Willow and George still have any feelings left for each other? Chapter 2. David had once gone through a dark period in his life, a time he almost couldn't escape from. Years ago, David and his brother were in a car accident. His brother shielded him and, unfortunately, lost his life. David was lucky to survive, but he spent several months bedridden. He was consumed by the pain of losing his brother, locking himself in his studio every day, wallowing in despair for a long time. He felt unworthy of living, and he attempted suicide countless times. In the end, his mother couldn't bear it anymore and slapped him, asking what it would take for him to move forward. He casually pointed to a painting, saying that if it could sell for 30 million, it would mean he was meant to live. 30 million. He thought no one would ever pay 30 million for a painting, unless they were out of their mind. But fate works in mysterious ways. Willow bought that painting. He disguised himself as a staff member and asked Willow why she bought the painting when he delivered it. After hearing her answer, he suddenly felt a complex mix of emotions. Besides a sense of mutual understanding, there was also something else. When he found out that Willow was married and that she had a harmonious relationship with her husband, he was happy for her but also felt a deep sense of loss and regret. He couldn't quite explain why. Chapter 3. One day, David saw George abroad. But the woman in George's arms wasn't his wife, it was another woman. A model. David felt a pang of sympathy for Willow. After that moment of sympathy, he suddenly realized that his opportunity had arrived. So he immediately booked a ticket back home. However, the road to winning Willow's heart was long and difficult. Willow often scolded him, calling him a homewrecker, comparing him to a piece of clingy gum that couldn't be shaken off, saying all sorts of harsh things. But it didn't matter. David was very optimistic and had a thick skin.